Prova, prova, prova. Prova, prova, prova.
Cominciamo? Ok. Allora, buonasera a tutti, grazie di essere qui.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here. My name is Lorenza Violini. I am going to serve as the moderator. we're going to talk about parliamentarism and democracy, a dialogue between the experiences in several European countries. I'm going to introduce to you my guests, Asunción de la Iglesia Chamarro, Chair of Constitutional Law at the University of Navarra, Miguel Maduro, the Dean and VDA Chair in Digital Governance at the Católica Global School of Law at the Portuguese Catholic University, and Francesco Palermo, who is Professor of Comparative Law at the University of Verona. As one of my dearest friends used to say, we have little time at our disposal, and the topic we're going to address is very vast. So I'm going to make no introduction. We all know that we have a severe crisis in our institutions, especially in our parliamentary system, because of the increasing presence of the activity of the government, who is increasingly acting as decision maker. So we're going to talk about this, possible remedies, and of the possible form of government we can approach. Italy, as Mr. Barbera used to say, has been trying to change the second part of its constitution since 1983, and it has never succeeded in doing so. Reforms have apparently started again, but I think that with this talk this evening, we would like to gain some more understanding. We would like to truly understand. We would like to truly go beyond taking a stance in favor of one party or the other. That means impoverishing democracy, because dialogue is the realm of dialogue and competence. I'm not going to spend further words on this, but I'd like to start trying to address the first of the topics I addressed. So, crisis in Parliament. What happens in Spain, in other countries, what happens in Europe, what happens in Italy, with reference to the crisis of our Parliament. How is the situation in our neighboring countries? And I'd like to leave the floor to Asunción. You have the floor. So good evening. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Lorenza Violini and the organizers of this meeting for their kind invitation in participating in this truly fascinating event. And I'd like to, as anticipated, I'm going to speak what is not correct. I'm not going to I'm not going to speak in Spanish, rather I'm going to talk in Italian. Sorry for mispronouncing your beautiful language. This is probably something that has to deal with what we have in mind. This is the crisis of our Parliament. We have the same problem, that is to say, the lack of words. Why is it that? Why is this? Because Parliament is the place of words. As Professor Violini rightly pointed out, today we scream. Rather than talk.
La polarizzazione.
And that is due to a high degree of fragmentation. In Spain as well, we have a problem with our parliament. As you probably know, we've long been talking about the crisis of Parliament. Parliaments play a central role in democracies. We cannot talk about democracy without a Parliament. And is it possible that we have a democracy without a Parliament? And at the same time, however, is it possible that we have a democracy with this pseudo-parliamentarism like the one we're witnessing now? And probably it's not possible to do without Parliament. At the same time, it's also equally not possible to have this degraded pseudo-parliamentarism, because we have to improve the situation. I also think that the division of powers that was postulated with the setting up of constitutionalism has now become different. There are different ways of different forms of division of parliament, of powers, sorry. We, however, irrespective of the form, we always need a form of representation, an assembly that can express the problems and the needs of society. That's the central role of Parliament. So members of Parliament have a representation mandate. At the same time, however, we have problems because of polarization, because of the fact that political parties sometimes do not send to Parliament the most skilled ones, the most clever ones, or maybe the problem is due to the fact that there's too many. In Spain, for example, we have, as in Italy, we have a two-chamber system. It is an imperfect two-chamber system. It's an imperfect one. We know that the Senate, that is conceived as a territorial representation chamber, does not work. We know this. And what happens in Spain, sorry? We are waiting for a constitutional reform, but that is not possible because much depends on the territorial design, and the political parties always try and calculate what they could lose with the reform. So actually, that's a stall, and it's not possible to reform Parliament. Everybody talks about opening up the constitutional reform. That is quite frightening in Spain. It's not like in Italy. In Spain, we are afraid of a constitutional reform because we had 1978, and back then we had truly a very high consensus in favor of one party that had never been registered before. So that is the reason why everybody talks about a constitutional reform, but the debate on that doesn't actually start. Today, Parliament is not so much deliberative. So Parliament apparently thinks a bit more about circus than about making decisions. And today as well, the very same forms to make decisions are against the system. This is possible. The very same constitutional court said that that's a form of expression. So there are no decisions, there are no deliberations, just monologues. Sometimes they are even embarrassing. And of course, this is not possible for society. Citizens see these monologues, and that's not very nice for them as well. There are problems in terms also of a procedure. In January 2024, part of the part of advisors to Parliament had to intervene in mass because members of parliament were not respecting ordinances. So the Constitutional Court said that that equaled a lack of decision-making technique. And that's also a problem. And there are no limitations to this lack. In Italy, too, we also had this increased use of law decrees. This happens in Spain as well. Law decrees are sometimes abused. And lately, lots of so-called omnibus decrees are being passed. And also the ability to make amendments is normally resorted to as a tool of exchange for other measures. So in this case, the Constitutional Court intervened, said that this is not a positive attitude. So I have to say that also the timing is not very good for Parliament. So this is probably this doesn't work very well. What can we demand Parliament today in the 21st century? Probably the decision-making process has to change. We need to adopt the decision-making system, a democratic decision-making system. And what can we retain and also strengthen of the activities of Parliament? Without a Parliament, we know there is no democracy. And if Parliament doesn't work, if it doesn't exist, then there is no democracy.
Grazie, effettivamente ci hai raccontato delle cose.
Thank you. You told us some things that we might be afraid of, and we are already used to all the different problems in the parliamentary proceedings. Miguel, you can tell us something about the crisis of parliamentarism and democracy. These are two intertwined concepts. First of all, let me thank for inviting me here at the meeting. This is my fifth or sixth time at the meeting. It's always a pleasure to be back here. Thank you for that. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss with you about this very interesting topic. In order to answer your question, I will first outline the reasons why parliaments are losing their power and are losing their interest and importance. And then I will relate that to a wider challenge for democracy today. So, you talked about the loss of relevance of parliaments in democracy. What are the underlying reasons? Well, there are four of them. First, the strengthening of the executive power with respect to parliaments. The strengthening of the executive power has been increasing, but it started a few decades ago. And it started with the development of the administrative state. The increased competencies of the state in areas that cannot be governed and managed by the parliament, but have increased administration significantly, and this is controlled by the executive power. So the growth in power of the governing state, of the administrative state, has led to the growth of the executive and increase in the executive power with respect to parliament. The second reason why the executive power has increased is the growing international interdependence, as in globalization, and the European integration process. Let me be clear on that. I am in favor of Europe. This increasing Europeanization is quite positive. In Europe, it has provided us a very good quality of life, which was unprecedented. However, that also had important consequences on the political systems of member countries, member states. And it's easy to understand that. Usually, the executive power is the one responsible for governing international policies and the participation of the different countries in international organizations and in the European Union. When there is an international negotiation to achieve an international treaty or an international agreement, or in the EU, when you have to adopt EU legislation or regulation, it is not possible to achieve that treaty or agreement with the participation of all national parliaments. So this is why the executive power is held responsible at an international level. As there is an increase in transfer of competences for international decision-making, there has been a transfer of power from Parliament to the executive power. If a national legislation is under the competence of the national parliament, at the European level, this is under the competence of the executive power. This is yet another factor that has contributed to the strengthening of the executive power, which is the first reason why there has been a loss in the importance of national parliaments. The second reason is the change in the nature of the political discourse and political parties. Politics has become increasingly professional. Politicians have changed. The way politicians are decided has changed. This has changed the nature of politics and the role of parliaments, as well as the nature and profiles of members of parliament. And this has reduced political participation in political parties. So, most citizens no longer feel represented by political parties, and there are interesting studies on that. Sometimes we hear that there has been a reduction in political participation. That is not really the case. There is a lower participation in elections, while there is an increase in participation in alternative political movements, which are not structured, which have no relation whatsoever to political parties or to formal trade unions or entities. So this change in the relation between the citizens and political parties has led to changes in the parliament, which has now different interests. The third reason for that leads to a paradox. There is an increase in political fragmentation and polarization, which is partly due to the fact that people no longer feel represented by traditional political parties. And so they are trying to identify with other political parties. There is a sort of renewal of political parties, and it has been so in the past few years in Europe. Political fragmentation leads to a paradox because, on the one hand, parliamentary majorities are less likely. So much so that we could expect an increased importance of the parliament, because when there is a clear majority controlled by one single party in a parliament, the parliament is an implementing body of the government. But if that is not the case, maybe parliaments could increase in importance. But on the other, the fragmentation and polarization makes it more difficult for the parliament to play its own main role, as in to reconcile the different political views of citizens. This is increasingly difficult in democracies in general and in parliaments. Reconciliation is increasingly difficult because, as you rightly said, the parliament is now shiting. They no longer have a debate in order to come to a political agreement, but rather to influence the public opinion, which has blocked the political skills, the activities of the parliament. It's more important to have an echo on the media than anything else. And the fourth reason is a change in the democratic process. Democracies are explained in a certain way. There are some topics, political topics, on which we focus according to their public importance. For example, if you watch the TV news, the headlines are related to the most important topic. Today, the trade unions, the political parties, the traditional media, the traditional newspapers are not the ones deciding about the most relevant topics, the most important topics, which has changed the nature of a parliament and has increased the importance of other public spaces where political debate now occurs. In some cases, the political debate is instrumental to what is happening outside the parliament. Often, the parliament is a sort of a byproduct of the political debate happening outside the parliament. Which leads me to my conclusion. As in, this relates to a much deeper change that is occurring in democracy, which explain the reasons why people and citizens feel less and less represented by their political institutions and politicians, which has an enormous impact on democracy. It is difficult to measure the quality of democracy. There are different indicators and international rankings on a democracy. They are very controversial, but we know something. There are surveys, satisfaction surveys, of citizens for democracy. And these satisfaction surveys are decreasing. And satisfaction is decreasing. If we ask people what is the political regime that they prefer, everyone prefers democracy. But at the same time, citizens say that they are less and less satisfied with democracy. In my opinion, this is pretty much connected to the transformation over the time, in space, and in the methodologies used by politics. This has an impact on the three prerequisites of democracy. Democracy is not just the right to vote. The right to vote is based on the fact that we all have the same political dignity. We all must have equal saying, an equal voice in decision-making. But that has some prerequisites. Cognitive prerequisites, as in the fact that if we express an opinion, we can express what we want, our own opinion, but that requires us to perceive the reality. And the way we build up our political preferences is changing. There's a difference between the national political space and the fact that many topics are interdependent. That has a strong impact on the way we're making up we're developing our political preferences. And sometimes we're not even aware of that. Umberto Eco always gave this example of a character, Fumes, of a work by Jorge Luis Borges. That was a character who had a wonderful memory. He knew everything, but in any case, he couldn't transform all this information, all this memory into knowledge, because he couldn't take a stance and he couldn't articulate a stance on anything. And this is the problem that we have with the internet, as in we have access to anything, but this is not but internet is not knowledge. And sometimes we don't know what is right or wrong. And then we communicate with each other in the democratic process. In a more polarized world and in a more radical world, it is more difficult to make decisions together and to come to an agreement. And these deeper changes partly explain the impact that we see in Parliament. And that gives us reason for concern in our democracies.
Grazie a Miguel Maduro.
Thank you very much to Miguel Maduro. You have told us very interesting things. And above all, you told us that institutions
Sono tendenzialmente non benissimo.
Institutions work as they are. They don't work tendentially very well, but there is a very important substrate in terms of communication capacity, thoughts, and also in terms of the ability to identify one's own preferences. Preferences are no longer stable. Interests are sometimes unstable. So conveying them to your representatives become very problematic. Francesco Palermo, you have the floor to conclude this first round. So thank you very much. Also on my part, thank you very much for your kind invitation, and thanks to my colleagues for actually sparing some of the work in analyzing the crisis of parliaments. I'd like to add a couple of reflections, and I'd also like to suggest a couple of ways out. Another possible reason of the crisis of parliamentarism is due to the fact that parliaments, as we know them today, are machines that were first conceived in the 19th century, that were first set up to serve the functions that they were supposed to carry out back then. That is to say, that of representing, of being an area of compromise between the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie. This is actually what they were supposed to do, and they did it well in a context in which, in continental Europe, about 1.5 or 2% of the population could vote. In the 20th century, parliaments changed, and this change went hand in hand with the onset of mass political parties. So instead of representing two social classes, we had political parties, and this enabled parliaments to work as places where decisions were made and compromises were reached for a relatively long period of time. When mass political parties entered a crisis, this happened in Italy more than in other countries, but the tendency can be more or less rapidly be seen everywhere. So when political parties went into crisis, also the very same parliaments went into a crisis, because our parliament is an old machine, and so the crisis is proportional to the disappearance of the players, in other words, of the ones who are called upon to have this machine work. So from this point of view, it's very difficult to come back. It's even not that useful. We'll never go back to the situation we had before. Like it or not, as experts in this field, we should rather look at the solutions rather than thinking about the good or bad old times. Let me give you another trivial example of the possible consequences of this. In Italy, we have something which is really unique, that's untranslatable in any other language, which is the so-called Decreto Mille Proroghe. It's a decree that is every year submitted by the government, whose aim is to basically postpone the terms of all the other laws. If certain deadlines are not respected, you just modify the law and you sort of change the deadline. This is something which is really unreadable. The decree is unreadable. You really have to go back to lots of different sessions of parliamentary work to truly understand what it is about. When you have that decree being analyzed in Parliament, you have the start of the mail bombing or spamming to all parliamentarians, warning them that if the decree is approved, well, then something really negative occurs, and so you cannot calculate how negative that can be. A couple of years ago, Mille Proroghe decree would postpone deadlines for the distinction in dairy firms, so in the separation in dairy firms between hard cheeses, in the production of hard cheeses and soft cheeses. You may be an expert in the topic, but can you tell me who among parliamentarians know the exact distinction between hard cheeses and soft cheeses? I don't think you can even expect that from a parliamentarian. So you receive a mail bombing telling you that if you approve that decree, well, you are going to make a favor to the Camorra, to the mafia, because actually this organized crime has interests in some dairy firms in the south of Italy. They buy them. So if you approve the decree, that means that you give the organized criminals a tool to buy them, to buy the dairy firm, and this case they can control that sector of the economy. And parliamentarians don't know anything about that. They have to say yes or no. They have to vote yes or no, but they're completely lost. Political parties served a function. They had an expert that could, in a way, tell exactly what the situation was about. With political parties, you could trust your mate in the same political party who could advise you in that specific field because they were knowledgeable about that. Today, we have politicians who are increasingly less professional. And this brings with itself also problems of the kind. So our humble parliamentarians don't know anything, and maybe in 20 years' time they will discover if they made a favor to the Camorra or not. Of course, we're not talking about responsibility. So the machine doesn't work. Another problem is the fact that in Parliament, you have the tendency of portraying the variety that exists in society. In Parliament, we have a tendentially large Parliament because the idea was that the whole variety of society could be represented in Parliament. This is today impossible. Even if you had a Parliament of 10,000 members, you could do that. So one should modify the type of representation we have in Parliament. At the moment, we only have a political representation. One might think of opting for a different diversification in functions. The same is done also in economics. Nobody invests in just one thing. At the same time, so diversifying political representation might be a solution. One often talks about the representation of territories, also with reference to the Spanish system. That doesn't work. The only second territorial chamber that works as such is not a second chamber. It is the Bundesrat in Germany, and it's not a second chamber. It's not democratic, it's not elected, its members are not elected. It works based on the instructions of the government of the Länder, so it's not a chamber. So one might think about assigning different functions to a second chamber. When Parliament adopts a law, it almost immediately loses sight of it. So governments have the technical structures that draft the pieces of legislation. They have them approved by their parliamentary majority, oftentimes without actually knowing what they are approving. And then once the law is approved, you completely forget the implementation of that. So there is no assessment tool. It would be much more meaningful if Parliament dealt with these issues, if Parliament assessed what happens after the approval of pieces of legislation, rather than simply pushing a button or applying a seal, and rather approving what other people elsewhere have approved. There's one more thing I'd like to say. We should just implement some minor changes. Working on parliamentary regulations might be an interesting solution. In Germany and in many other countries, we don't have a mixed group of parliamentarians. The mixed group is a group in Parliament where you have all the parliamentarians that in a way come out of their prior political parties. They do not lose anything in entering a mixed group. But if that is not present, that means that you have a more compact political representations in Parliament. So you don't have parliamentarians being elected with one party and then changing their representation. In Germany, if you're not part of a group, you lose all the benefits of the parliamentarians. You don't have an office, you don't have a legislative office or a press office. I mean, you don't have lots of benefits. Then, the rationalization of times. Professor Maduro, who is very expert in European affairs, could tell us a lot about how the European Parliament works. Basically, European members of the European Parliament do not find themselves lost, as happens in national parliament, because at the beginning of the legislature, they are assigned a dossier, and so for 5 years, they deal with just an issue. So even if they're not big experts, they become experts over time, and they can therefore be more effective compared to those who don't know what they're talking about. For example, in Italy, we often tend to complain about our parliament. However, in terms of quantity, the Italian parliament is the one that works the most in the world in terms of number of worked hours and in terms of adopted piece of legislation. There's too many of them. The Italian parliament should work less and better. This is not a kind of reform that is, in my view, not so appealing. And then there's a last point. let's talk about the function of Parliament, not so much as a division, as a separation between the majority and the minority, with all the consequences that this may have, but rather Parliament should be seen as a place in which an agreement is reached between the various political forces. Friedrich Dürrenmatt, a great Swiss writer, used to say that either the world becomes as Switzerland or it is bound to decline. So what does Switzerland have that is so peculiar? It has a system which is basically forces everybody to find an agreement. It has basically a system based on kind of association. It is a system based on which you can find an agreement depending on the measures. This brings about a real growth and maturation of the individual political forces. This is a model that aims at protecting minority voices rather than producing winners. So one has to protect those who lose rather than those who win. Probably the objective of Parliament, probably parliaments could work better if they were not machines for majorities that vote in bloc, but rather places where coalitions can be formed. Probably in this way, many more things could be done, and other countries have more experience on this. The tendency to go towards the model of the winner takes all is very much widespread, nearly everywhere.
Effettivamente devo confessare che se anch'io dovessi...
Well, I need to say that if I had to vote on the production of soft or hard cheese, I would have some problems, like anyone else. But that idea that you mentioned is quite simple. And so far, it has not yet been implemented in our system. So let's continue with the second round. Let's talk about the form of government. The form of government means the relations between the government and the parliament. And we said that the government is increasing its power and the parliament is decreasing its power. But we know that there can be different relations between the government and the parliament. And there are different types of relations between the sovereign people and the parliament or the government with parliamentary or presidential systems. Even in that case, there are problems, but there are systems that are better and there are others that are worse. Right now, the government is also thought about proposing a reform on that. Now, let's focus on that. The forms of government, what are they and how do they work? I just remind our speakers that you will have to be short because you're very kind with us, but we don't have too much time. We don't have to prevent one of our fundamental rights, which is a right to have dinner not too late. Okay, let's start again. Francesco, we'll start from the last one. Okay. So you want to know about the German form of government. Very shortly. It's a form of parliamentary government based on stability. There are many systems and there are many technicalities. I will not go into detail, but basically the form of government can endure throughout the legislature. So far in Germany, there have been 9 chancellors, whereas in Italy, we have number the 31st Prime Minister today with the same number of legislators, one legislature less in Germany. Then in Italy there were 68 governments, whereas in Germany there were 25. So this system works from that standpoint. It just doesn't work because there are very strict technical rules, but also for what is around it. As in, I'll give you some examples. Technical and constitutional rules are very important. In Germany, there has been a very strong reaction to what happened to the Weimar Republic. And there was a system where everything is governed, even how many times the chancellor can go to the toilet. Everything is governed very strictly. But this is not enough, because there are many other rules underlying this system. For example, there is a law on parties which in Italy has never been approved. Political parties are private associations like any other association, like any private association on any other topic. So there is no rules for that. This is not the case for Germany, where there are rules, and political parties have to be serious. This is the adjective that is used, and seriousness of political parties is measured by some criteria. For example, a political party cannot come out of scratch and run for regional or federal elections. It is possible at a local level, but it takes some time for the party to develop, to become mature. It needs to have some internal rules. And parties also have to be organized democratically. Now there is a newborn political party which is now monitored by secret services because of its non-compliance with constitutional criteria. There's going to be very important regional elections very soon, and the federal elections next year. The number of political parties in Germany is increasing, so it's far from perfect, but certainly the German system is sounder than ours. Then there are political associations financed by the state, which are independent, that provide political training. They involve people. They bridge the gap that was mentioned before between people and political parties. That creates a stronger political culture. For example, in Italy, we have to know who is going to be the head of government at the night immediately right after elections. In Germany, it takes months before making up a government, months of negotiations. The coalition agreement, the current coalition agreement between three political parties, which is the first in Germany, has required the creation of 22 working groups, 144 coalition agreement. So it's a sort of book with all the different notes. And different months. So, when the government is created, then there are constitutional rules. The government has different rules on how it has to be set up. There must be an absolute majority in parliament with no official trust, with no debate. The parliament cannot be dissolved. A confidence vote is also important. In Germany, only the confidence vote has only been used once in history. Confidence in Italy is totally different. So, since 1949, the problem of confidence in Germany has occurred only 5 times. These are extreme measures, and they must exist in a constitution. But without different rules creating a political culture, then it's very difficult for a government to survive. In Italy, Italy now would like to introduce a totally new form of government. It is okay to test. It is not possible to invent new forms of government. Maybe Italy could copy from Germany, maybe things could work, maybe not. But the point is what's going to happen on representation. And it is important to reflect on that. We could also decide about having a totally different model than Germany, knowing exactly who the winner is immediately and giving the winner an automatic parliamentary majority. But the Italian constitution is based on compromise. There are parliamentary majority thresholds for all constitutional guarantees, and these thresholds are very low, maximum 60% for the election of constitutional judges by the parliament. The President of the Republic can be elected by absolute majority. The Constitution can be changed, amended by absolute majority. The layman of the Magistracy Council can be elected by absolute majority, and so on and so forth. If a parliamentary majority is created and can do all of that with no absolute majority, then there's going to be an imbalance. So, if the aim is to ensure government stability, and we don't want to adopt strict parliamentary rules, like in Germany, direct election should be okay, but we need to increase the thresholds. Otherwise, majorities would control guarantee mechanisms. And this is a pending issue. Thank you. Okay. Miguel, what do you think? Let's have a look at Europe also.
I'd like to start by giving you a general overview. I'd like to first talk about Portugal. So the impact of the European dimension on what happens in the individual states. I would like to reiterate what was said before. Together with us, we have Paul Kahn, who wrote extensively on the importance of political culture in the Constitution. So he said that a constitution is the result of a political culture and not only of constitutional rules. And this is particularly important. So the very same constitutional rules can produce forms of government that are very different, that bring about very different results, because the integration between constitutional rules and other rules bring about different results, or because it is the very same practice of political players legitimates certain rules and not others. Let me give you an example talking about cooperation between Italy and Portugal. Italy and Portugal are semi-presidential nations that have then become parliamentary, but they have a very strong semi-parliamentary component. So Portugal would theoretically be a semi-parliamentarian regime with more powers of the President of the Republic, which, because unlike Italy, in Italy, the President of the Republic is directly elected, so he's elected by universal direct suffrage. And like Italy, he has the power to appoint the government and the Prime Minister, the head of the government. However, in Portugal, even if today it would be impossible to have governments of presidential initiative, or the so-called technical governments. Not so much because this is not allowed by constitution, but rather because this would not be accepted politically as the interpretation of these political norms, of these constitutional norms. So similar rules can bring about very different results due to a different political practice. In France, the regime has become more presidential when we started carrying out the elections of the president at the same time of the president. So legislative elections or being organized on the same day of the elections of the president had brought with itself the coincidence with the same majority, and in this case, it is the President of the Republic who is the real leader of the government. Now, with the anticipated elections that Macron did, this changed again. But that's the very first important point, practice. So the political practice is important exactly as the same time as the rules of a certain form of government. This is important also to, in a way, spend some words of warning. We have to be wary and to be cautious. One of the most common mistakes that are made in the proposals of reform of political systems is that we are always comparing a political model as implemented with the idea of a political system that is idealized and that refers only to rules. When we look at the political system only as a set of rules, we have an idea, an image that is too idealized, and that is not the actual implementation of that government. And this, in turn, leads us to have a negative cycle, because we are constantly making this comparison, and the comparison is not true. There was another professor from the US, Newcomer, who used to say that one is always comparing an institution which is in its practical and tangible implementation with an idealized one. In reality, we have to be aware of the fact that we are constantly making choices between imperfect alternatives. And models will never be idealized. So, very briefly, talking about our interactions with the European Union. The European Union impacts in different ways in political systems. One of them is the reinforcement of the executive power. The executive power is much more powerful in European politics than in national parliaments. The second example lies in the reinforcement of independent entities, the reinforcement, for example, of central banks or of competition authorities. So there is a very strong impact on the part of the European Union. It was the EU that basically brought about a stronger, much greater independence of these organizations. More recently, the European Union is exercising an even deeper impact because it has started influencing the state of law and the independence of judges. And in this respect, it will always play a potential role in guaranteeing the separation of powers at a national power. This is very much debatable. Many people believe that this is not, that this should not be the case. But however, there is a justification, which is not that the European Union has to guarantee that all member states actually implement things that are against democracy. That's not the main reason why the European Union has played this role. The main reason is that the European Union cannot, in a way, implement the state of law in all the states if the member states do not implement it in full, because European laws, so the laws that European citizens have are mainly applied by national courts. If a national court, which is the one that implements, that applies the European Union law, is not independent, that's not only a problem for the guarantee of rights inside a state, but that's a problem also for the guarantee of rights in the EU, in that specific member state. In the future, we will be faced with the same issue in democracy. The European democracy, the democracy of the European Union, has one guardian, which is basically the participation of member states in council, but also the European Parliament, which is a co-legislator, and which is also the body that has scrutiny over the European Commission. So the European Parliament, if the elections of the European Parliament is elected at the level of a member state, and if in that member state there is no freedom of press, no freedom of expression, no freedom of political organization, well then the members of the European Parliament elected in that specific member state that will do legislation for all the other member states will not have been elected democratically. So the lack of democracy in a member state does not affect only that specific member state, but that becomes a democratic problem for the whole EU. So this is the European challenge in relation with the political systems and the political representations in the member states. This will contribute to the progressive growth of the role of the European Union in the forms of government, in the guarantee of democracy and the state of law in its member states. On the one hand, this is further guarantee. On the other hand, this is a source of tension with national sovereignty. Thank you very much. That was very, very clear. Thank you very much. Actually, well understand that the dynamics of these forms of government can be cannot be the subject of being in favor or not. Asunción, you have actually, I can say that we could never close this dialogue, but Asunción, you can come to a concluding, you can draw some concluding remarks with reference to your system to enrich our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. As already said by the previous speakers, let me underline that there is no perfect form of government. Now, this is the first thing we have to say. We have created an ideal model, but then we have always the perception, the idea that this ideal model cannot be achieved. And it's not just a problem of rules, because the main rules can work in many different ways. I'll talk to you about the Spanish system. We have had a late constitution because our constitution came about after a civil war. We had a civil war between 19 39 and 76. So we know what polarization and political fragmentation are. So consensus is of the utmost importance. Consensus is based on cooperation, and the form of parliamentary government is based on all those principles. The Spanish Constitution has a model that derives from Europe and is inspired by the German model, where there is a parliamentary system, although there is some difference that this is a parliamentary, ours is a parliamentary democracy, monarchy. And we have a different system because there are no democratic rules, there are no elections, but there is a specific system which is not democratically elected. Over the 46 years after the approval of the Spanish Constitution, we had 7 presidents and 2 queens. That leads to stability. But we should have time to talk about parliamentary monarchy, but if we had a specific system, because if there is someone that has no power to decide anything, then it's not easy to manage the system, because to some extent a monarchy is a form of tradition, and that form of government was accepted due to the role of the monarchy. And today the king, the head of state, is the symbol of life and continuation. But there must be good representation of institutions and of political parties. The king does not appoint the prime minister. The king cannot reject a bill. The king doesn't have any active power, as in it reigns, but it doesn't govern. It can be consulted. The king only has a symbolic power, but at this time, at times like this, it can influence the political discourse. And we have an example for that. When there was the Declaration of Independence of Catalonia, the government didn't do anything. And there was a speech by the king in October 2017. Today, the monarchy has to take on historical challenges and family challenges, because there seems to be a family problem there and a problem for the head of state. I don't want to be too long here, but even when there's a problem, for example, in October 2023, Princess Leonor swore to the Constitution before Parliament. So we're talking about continuity and stability. Also, the system worked pretty well. And when there is a fragmented parliament, we had some functioning until 2015, and then there was a fragmented parliament, and so problems started. So the president of the government is chosen by one chamber of deputy. The Senate doesn't vote, and the king has the power to propose, has the power of proposal, and can talk to all the political parties. But after 2015, we started to have problems to form governments, not just to have the absolute majority, but also to have simple majority, because a parliamentary fragmentation has made things more difficult. After 2018, for the first time, there was a lack of confidence for the government. And lack of confidence was destructive, because everyone was against the majority. Everyone also means also those that do not want the constitution, that want the Spanish independence. So the coalition now needs to have the votes of parliament to appoint the head of the government. And that is somewhat difficult. For example, amnesty. Now we're also asking for the independence, sovereign independence, and for tax independence. So we are going through different times. We're somewhat concerned. But here there is a challenge ahead. Spain has a challenge to take on. And the challenge is how to go back to dialogue and not to build walls between two parties. I am concerned by the fact that we need the bridges. We talked a lot about peace at the meeting here. It's easy to think about populism, to think in populistic terms, and to see the political rival as an enemy. And this is the risk in Spain right now. It's a time of strong polarization. And we need to speak as we have done here at the meeting. And this meeting in Rimini is also is really very, very interesting, because peace is not lost. Peace is not lost all of a sudden. We have to create bridges and not to build walls. And in order to create bridges, we need to have a better dialogue among us. Thank you. Okay. I think that we have opened up new question marks and issues. Please bear with me, because I want to remind all of you that the meeting does exist because we are all involved in financing the meeting. You all know about the Dona Ora desks, which are everywhere at the fair, but you have to be aware that some money that you're going to give the meaning is going to be allocated to Cardinal Pizzaballa and to the Holy Land. After his wonderful opening and dramatic opening, we have thought about giving our own economic contribution to the Holy Land for the reconstruction of peace in Israel and the Palestine territories. So please make an effort because some of the money that we're going to collect is going to be given to that noble goal. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much to the different speakers, and see you next time on the debate on these topics. Thank you. Enjoy your evening.
Tanto, sì, sì. Quando spengono la luce rossa.